Let's rig a tongue in Blender. In this setup, the deformation of the tongue relies on Bendy Bones, an armature modifier with preserve volume ticked on, and a corrective smooth modifier, so I don't have to bother with weight paint too much. If you plan to export this to a game engine, you can use regular bones and no corrective smooth modifier. It should do just fine if you blur the automatic weight paints results enough. The rig itself can be separated into two levels. First, the base. That is the chain of bones in the middle of the tongue. That's where most of the mechanisms will be. Second, the side chains. They're more like a fancy addition and allow for more complex movements of the tongue thanks to tweaker bones. It can be overkill in a lot of situations, especially for game characters. The rig offers both FK and IK controllers. It starts off easy. Add a bone at the base of your tongue model. That will be our def tongue base bone. It'll make sure the tongue never detaches from the throat. Then, extrude a little chain to the tip. Here, I've got 5 bones, but the number depends on the length of your model. Repeat the process on the left side if you want to include the second level. Make sure both chains have the same bone number. You can batch rename the middle bones def tongue or def tongue mid by selecting them all, going to Edit, Batch Rename, Bones, Set Name, and New. I added the batch rename option to my quick menu to make things easier, so I just have to press Q to access it. The same way, you can rename the side chain deftongue.l. The .l suffix is important to symmetrize the chain later. If you want to use Bendy Bones, go to the armature properties and change the display mode from a cathedral to be bones. You can scale them down using Alt plus Shift plus CTRL plus SN. Select all the bones except the base bone. Go to the Bendy Bones panel and in Segments, add the number you want. If you hold Alt before hitting Enter, it'll change the number for all selected bones. For a short tongue, you won't need a lot of segments. While we're at it, let's go to the bottom of the panel and change the handle types from automatic to absolute, holding Alt when selecting it. I find absolute to give a better curvature to the bones, but feel free to test the other settings. One good way to get a good curvature is to use the previous def bone as the start handle, and the following def bone as the end handle. The biggest downside is that you kind of lose the ability to bend the bones by rotating the handles, but we don't need it here, as it'll get replaced by moving a tweaker bone. It's a bit tedious. At the end, you can select everything and using Shift-N, recalculate the roll of the bones on the global plus Z axis. That's more of a preference. Tweakers are the root of the controller hierarchy and the only ones to affect the deformation bones. In edit mode, select all the bones and with OP clear all the parents. Then, extrude new bones with E on the Y axis. For convenience, you can create a new bone collection to put them in. You can then clear their parent, and holding the Alt key, disable the deform option. That way, they can't affect the deformation of the tongue, and they won't create vertex groups when using automatic weight painting. You can batch rename the middle ones to tweak tongue, and the side ones to tweak tongue.l by switching to the find replace option, and replacing def by tweak. You can also delete the left tweaker at the very tip, and rename the other tip bone, tweak tongue tip. Choosing strip characters and selecting end, digits, and punctuation, you can reset their numbering. You can also give them a color. And you can recalculate their roll to align them with world space. Now, we want to parent every def bone to the tweaker before them, except for the base bone. In pose mode, we'll add a damped track and a stretch to constraint to all def bones, targeting the tweaker in front of them. The tweaker at the tip will control the end of both chains. Make sure both def bones at the end are snapped to the tweak tongue tip bone. It's tedious but needed. At this point, you can symmetrize everything and parent the tongue model to the rig using automatic weight paint. Unless you need to export this, add a corrective smooth modifier and tip preserve volume in the armature modifier options to get a better deformation. You might not even need to touch the weights after that. We need a chain of bones that will act as a switch between the FK chain and the IK chain. You can duplicate the middle def chain, except the base bone, and put it in a new collection named MCH for mechanism. You can batch rename them MCH switch tongue. Let's reset the bendy bone segments to 0, using out, and clear the parents. We want them to be parented to each other in a chain. In pose mode, clear their constraints. You can also disable the deform option. If you're using the side chains, you can duplicate the middle tweakers except the first and the last ones, squash them down and make them thicker. Batch rename them to tweak mask tongue and parent both their corresponding mid and side tweakers to them. Then you can parent the new master tweakers to the MCH bone behind them. Now, if you move the MCH bones, the tweakers should follow and the tongue should bend. Duplicate the base bone, disable deform, remove the constraints, and parent both the first tweaker and the first MCH bone to it. This will be our CTRL tongue-based bone, and will be shared by both FK and IK chains. Duplicate the MCH chain, put it in a new collection, and batch rename the bones to something like CTRL-FK tongue. Let's extrude the end bone, rename it CTRL-FK mask tongue, and unparent it. Usually, I put this kind of controller at the beginning of the FK chain, but in this case, the bone will control both rotation and stretching of the tongue, so it feels more natural to have it at the tip. You can place it at the base if you prefer. Now, I also want intermediary controllers. Since my chain has 6 bones, I'll divide it in 3 parts by extruding 2 new bones. They'll be named CTRL-FK tongue tip and CTRL-FK tongue mid. I'll then parent them to the FK bone behind them, and add a copy rotation constraint to the 2 FK bones in front of them. The constraint should be set to local space, and the mix mode to add, so that the chain can still be controlled. Sometimes local space own orientation gives better results, especially if your model is not flat to begin with, and if you add a copy rotation with the same settings to the intermediary ones, targeting the master controller, you can bend the whole chain. I also mentioned stretching the tongue out. For that, we'll need 3 more MCH bones, 1 at the master controller, 1 at the CTRL-FK tongue mid bone, and the last 1 bone further. You'll need to rename them accordingly. You can space them out more if you have a long tongue. You might also want more MCH bones. The 1 at the tip shouldn't have a parent for now, but the other 2 should be parented to it. Then, we'll add a copy location to the tip bone targeting the master controller. We can leave it to world space. OK, second to last step. Since the FK bones in the chain already have a parent, we need to use copy location constraints again. Let's add one to the FK bones sharing the positions of the 2 MCH bones placed on the tongue. The MCH bones are the targets and the constraints need to be in world space. You can lower the strength of those new copy location constraints to around 0.4 or 0.5 to get a nice stretching effect. If the FK chain doesn't split, make sure the bones with the copy location constraints aren't connected to their parent. If they are, that means they share the joint and can't be split apart, and that's the FK controllers done. Now, the last step is to make sure the MCH switch bones follow the FK chain by using copy transforms constraint. We'll use drivers on them once the IK chain is ready. Here, we won't use regular IK, but Spline IK. The Spline IK deforms a chain of bones along a curve. We'll be controlling the curve using bones as hooks. Start by duplicating the FK chain minus the controllers, put it in a new collection, and hide everything else. Rename the new bones MCHIK tongue and clear the constraints. In this example, the C2RL tongue-based bone will act as the first hook. I'll need to add a new controller bone at the tip, but I also want 2 more controllers like for the FK chain, so 1 every 2 bones. Don't hesitate to add more or less according to your needs. Once the controllers are placed and named, go into object mode and add a Bezier curve to place it in the middle of the tongue. Shape it so it roughly follows the bone chain. Subdivide it so you'll have the same number of points and IK controllers. And using the cursor, snap the handles to the controller bones. In pose mode, select the first controller, then back to the curve in edit mode. Select the corresponding handle, press CTRL-H, and choose hook to selected object bone. Repeat for all handles. Now, let's add a master controller at the tip and duplicate it to create a new MCH bone that will act as an intermediary between the master and the regular controllers. It'll mainly make sure that when you scale the master controller, the other controllers aren't pushed away. Parent the first 2 regular controllers to it. The other one should be parented to the C2RL tongue-based bone. Add copy location and rotation constraints to the intermediary MCH bone, targeting the master controller. Leave them in world space. You can hide the MCH bone. Finally, let's add a Spline IK constraint to the last bone of the chain. If it gets snapped to the back of the tongue, switch the direction of the curve segments. You can now tell the MCH switch bones to follow their corresponding IK bone by using another copy transform constraint. If the tongue looks a bit blocky when deforming, crank the factor of the corrective smooth up to 1, and add a subdivision modifier to make things extra smooth. To be able to switch from IK to FK, we need to use a driver and create a custom property that will control the switch. In a full character rig, I'd have a property bone to store it, but here let's just add it to the C2RL tongue base. Make the property a boolean, unless you want a smooth transition between the 2 modes, in which case a float will do fine. Give it an appropriate name like IK/FK tongue by right-clicking on the little box and choosing copy as new driver. We can go to the first MCH switch bone and paste the driver on the icon of the first copy transform constraint. If you chose to use a float, just paste the driver on the influence value of the constraint instead. Paste the driver on the eye of the second constraint, right-click on it, and choose Edit Driver. We want this one to be inverted, so that when the property is enabled, the constraint is disabled. You just need to switch the type from average value to scripted expression, and add -1 in front of the variable name that should already be there. That'll be enough to invert the value. That's it. Now you can copy and paste the same driver setup to all MCH switch bones and the switching will work. Some bonus actions will only be possible if you went with the 2-level rig, as they rely on the side tweakers. You may have noticed that you can't rotate the tongue on the Y-axis in IK, and that in both modes, you cannot use the controllers to scale the tongue. Let's tackle the twisting first, which is 2-level only. We'll add a copy rotation to the IK controllers themselves, targeting the master IK controller. The constraints should be in local space, with the mix mode set to add, and only copy the y-axis. And because the controllers are rotating the handles of the curve and not the bones, you will also need to add a copy rotation with the same settings to the main tweakers targeting their corresponding IK controller. For the scaling, you will also want to influence the main tweakers, or the regular tweakers if you went with a 1-level rig. They'll each need 2 copy scale constraints, one for FK and one for IK. For the IK scale, the target should be the controller in front of the tweakers. For the FK, it is similar, except that the tip tweaker replaces the tip IK controller. The constraints should be in world space, with offset ticked so you can still manually change the scale. In both FK and IK, since the controllers aren't parented to their master controller, you'll need to give them a copy scale too, targeting the master. In FK, since we used the tip tweaker to control the scale of tip, it'll need to copy the scale of the master too. Lastly, tongue folding. It's more of a fancy addition, not at all necessary. If you went with a 1-level rig, you can make this by using a shape key with a driver. Here, we'll see about the 2-level rig, and how to use the transformation constraint to achieve it. First, we want to add a last controller, which will also be put into both IK and FK collections. It should be named something like CTRL fold tongue, and you can lock all the location and rotation channels, because we won't be using them. Now, we'll give a folded pose to the tongue using the tweakers. Once that's done, we'll add a transformation constraint to one of the tweaker targeting the fold controller. The transformation constraint acts kind of like a simplified driver. It'll perform a transformation operation to a bone if the target bone is transformed a certain way. For example, if I move this icosphere on the x-axis by 5, this cube will rotate by 180 on the z-axis. Unlike the copy constraints, transformations of targets and owners don't have to be of the same type, on the same axis, or of the same value. So back to our rig, we need to decide how we'll use our controller. Personally, I like to scale it down on the x-axis, so in the constraint, I'll set the spaces to local, choose scale in the map from panel, and put something like 0.5 as the minimum x value. Then, in the map to panel, I'll leave location on and change all the axes to x, since all the translations will be based on the target's x-axis. Lastly, I'll copy and paste the location values of the tweaker as the minimum values of the map to panel and reset its location in pose mode. You can now copy the constraint to all the tweakers that have been posed, and repeat the copy-paste step for all of them. Leave the controller to its original scale until you're done to avoid confusions. And that's it. You can now clean up the rig. Make sure that all the bones are organized into collections. Give them colors and shapes. Rename some of the constraints to make it more readable, etc. This tutorial is now over. I hope you found it useful. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe. Cheers.